Welcome to Mike's Retro Curiosities, where we explore the wonderful world of retro games. Today, we're taking a look at the original Super Mario Bros. This game was released for the Famicom and the NES in 1985. September 13th, 2025 actually marks the 40th anniversary of this game's release. It was created by Nintendo R&D 4. Super Mario Bros. Was produced, directed, designed, and had artwork done by Shigeru Miyamoto. Takashi Tezuka would co-direct and was also responsible for a lot of the art. Programming was done by Toshihiko Nakago and Kazuki Morita. Finally, the game was composed by Koji Kondo. Super Mario Bros. Is one of the most important, influential, and iconic video games ever created. When this game hit, it didn't so much change the medium as drop an atomic bomb on it. It would end up reshaping nearly all of gaming around itself. Virtually every game released today has at least a little bit of this game's DNA. And pretty much the entirety of gaming history can be subdivided into pre- and post-Super Mario Bros. To really understand why this game had such a massive impact, we're going to have to first take a look back at what came before. Throughout much of the 70s and early 80s, the standard form of action game was that of the single-screen high-score chaser. Everything about these games had to be communicated immediately to the player, and the goal was usually just to try and last as long as possible and rack up the best score. There were things like RPGs and adventure games that had larger game worlds with beginnings, middles, and ends, but these were generally the exception rather than the rule. Throughout the early to mid-80s, developers had begun to experiment with the use of multiple screens. A good example of this is Nintendo's own Donkey Kong, which utilized 4 screens which the player progressed between in a manner somewhat similar to that of the scenes in, say, a play or a movie, which created a sense of narrative progression. The game starts with Pauline getting kidnapped, then has the hero progress through a series of challenges before ending with sending the titular ape crashing down. Eventually, it was realized that by directly linking different screens together, it was possible to expand the play space that the game could take place in and create a sense of continuity. Thus was born the flip-screen platformer. A few examples of this style of game are Pitfall, Montezuma's Revenge, and Impossible Mission. At about the same time, developers had begun experimenting with the use of scrolling to achieve the same end, creating the sense of a continual playfield. This technique was first utilized in genres like racing and shooting games. However, it was soon realized that it was particularly well-suited for platformers. In 1981, Alpha Denshi released Jump Bug, the first side-scrolling platformer, followed by Moon Patrol the next year. And in 1984, just a year before SMB's release, Namco would release the side-scrolling platformer Pac-Land. And while it's never been officially stated, many gaming historians, myself included, strongly suspect that Pac-Land had a very heavy influence on Super Mario Bros. So by 1985, there existed an emerging trend towards larger, more continuous games, with 2D platformers becoming increasingly prominent. So technically, Super Mario Bros. Didn't invent anything wholly new. It was far from the first side-scrolling platformer on the market. What it did do is take a number of disparate ideas that were kind of floating around at the time and combine them into one cohesive whole, as well as apply these principles with a degree of nuance and subtlety that players had never seen before. It should also be noted that while Super Mario Bros. Was released at the launch of the NES here in America, over in Japan, the Famicom was already 2 years old. So far, most of the games released for it had been exactly the sort of short, high-score chasing games that had been the standard for over a decade. As a result, the Famicom was already kind of starting to show its age by this point. To meet the demand for larger and more complex games, Nintendo planned to expand the system using an add-on called the Famicom Disk System. But before that was released, Miyamoto wanted to make one final game that would push the base NES hardware to its limits. The vast majority of NES games that we associate with the console here in North America actually don't use the base hardware. Instead, they came out later and utilized more advanced memory mapping chips that greatly enhanced the system's capabilities. Limiting things even further is the fact that Super Mario Bros. Only came on a 40 kilobyte ROM. To give you an idea of how minuscule that is, a single frame from this very video contains more data than the entirety of this game. The vast majority of later NES games had much larger file sizes, with the largest being 768 kilobytes for Kirby's Adventure. Without larger file sizes and more advanced memory mapper chips, games like Ninja Gaiden and Contra on the NES would be impossible in their current form. This is why early black box games were so simple. This is also why, when Super Mario Bros. Released, it blew away pretty much everything else on the market. One aspect of this game that's very much worth discussing is its controls. Platformers before Super Mario Bros. Tended to be fairly basic in terms of how you manipulated the on-screen character. Controls tended to be very binary. Either you were pushing a button to make something happen or you weren't. Super Mario Bros. Allowed players to vary the heights of their jumps based on how long they held down the button. A light tap would produce a small hop, whereas holding down the button would produce a mighty leap. For that matter, you were also allowed to vary the trajectory of your mid-air leap by pressing left or right on the control pad. From a real-world physics standpoint, this doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. Generally, when a person hops into the air, they can't then control their trajectory mid-jump. But it felt very natural within the context of the game. Mario also possessed momentum and could build up more of it by holding down the B button to run. Getting a running start allows for bigger jumps, but momentum needed to be taken into account for position because Mario can't stop on a dime. These controls were highly intuitive and easy to learn while also being very nuanced, allowing for a high degree of fine control and skill expression. More than that, Super Mario Bros. Simply felt really good to play. The controls lend the game a bouncy and athletic feel. This is an early example of a subtle but crucial aspect of game design that would eventually come to be known as kinesthetics or game feel. With such great controls, Super Mario Bros. Was able to feature much more intricate and complex level design. The game would ultimately end up setting a new standard for the medium in this regard. The game features 8 worlds, each of which contain 4 levels for a total of 32 levels. This was absolutely massive for the time, and to prevent the game from feeling repetitive, it also incorporated a wide variety of gameplay challenges. This necessitated a vastly different approach to level design from what had come before. Super Mario Bros. Is incredibly elegant in its design. Every block and enemy has a purpose, and every screen is composed in such a way that it draws the player's attention to important details. Levels are also designed to teach the players how to play the game as they go. This can be best highlighted through an analysis of the game's first and most famous level, 1-1. 1-1 is brilliantly designed and to this day remains the gold standard for introductory levels. In literally the first screen immediately after the player presses start, the game is already instructing the player. By starting Mario so far to the left, it creates negative space to the right that the player feels an instinctive need to fill by moving in that direction. In doing so, it introduces players to the most fundamental thing that they will be doing in the game, moving right. Soon they're introduced to the second most fundamental aspect of the game with the introduction of the first enemy, jumping. It is impossible to go any further without jumping over this first enemy. Luckily, should players be bested by this first obstacle, they at least haven't lost much progress. Next, players are confronted with a group of blocks, several of which contain question marks that flash enticingly. In this area, players are taught how Mario interacts with different kinds of blocks. Small Mario bonks off of brick blocks, while question mark blocks contain goodies. One in particular contains a power-up that, when discovered, starts moving to the right, drops down, and bounces off the pipe towards the player. This in turn teaches the player both how mushrooms behave as well as how objects in the world react to their environment, i.e. that they are affected by gravity and will bounce off of solid objects. Odds are good that the player will then touch that mushroom and discover what it does. If they try to jump over it, odds are good they will bonk their heads on the brick blocks and end up collecting it anyway. And wouldn't you know, now that Mario has become super, he can break the bricks that the player had previously bonked off of. Blocks that just so happen to be in the immediate vicinity of where Mario acquired the power-up, allowing the player to immediately learn what it can be used for. From there, players come across a series of pipes of varying heights. It's worth noting that the game is actually hard-coded to not have any piranha plants in the pipes of level 1-1 so as not to overwhelm the player. The purpose of these pipes is to get the player used to jumping, in particular to learn how to utilize high jumps by holding down the button. One of the pipes contains a secret, an underground area that skips players further ahead in the level with coins as a reward for the player's curiosity. Assuming that the player does not take the pipe, they have the opportunity to discover another secret in the form of an invisible block that contains a 1-up mushroom. These secrets teach players that there's often more to levels than meets the eye, and that they should search thoroughly. We then encounter the first hole with a bottomless pit that will kill players that fall in. It's only 2 blocks wide, so it's easy to clear, but it serves to make completely certain that players have mastered jumping. From there, the player reaches a small row of blocks with a question mark block in the center. Above is a longer row of blocks with a pair of Goombas that fall onto the shorter row. The Goombas are positioned so that they will fall and reach the middle block right when the player is most likely to hit it, which in turn teaches the player that enemies can be defeated from below by hitting blocks as they walk over them. From here, the path splits. Players can follow the ground and will discover a more difficult pit, or they can jump onto the longer row of blocks, which provides a safe upper route. Soon after, the player has their first encounter with a star. As the star bounces away, it looks as though it might get away from the player, but it's actually very limited in terms of where it can bounce due to strategic placement of blocks. By now, players have been conditioned to associate yellow and gold flashing objects with good things like question blocks and coins, so the player will likely try to touch it. If they do, the game immediately presents a row of 7 enemies to plow through, demonstrating the new item's utility. If they don't go for the star, they will instead encounter a Koopa Troopa for the first time. This enemy behaves differently from Goombas in that stomping on it causes it to retreat into its shell. Players can then kick the shell and use it to dispatch enemies. To teach this principle, a conveniently placed row of 6 Goombas is provided. This then helps clue players into another mechanic. Consecutive kills with a shell multiplies how many points are received by dispatched enemies. This hints at, but doesn't completely give away, the fact that it's possible to gain extra lives by killing enough consecutive enemies. The triangle of question blocks helps perfect the player's fine control of Mario by having him jump on narrow platforms. Next, the game introduces a set of stair-like arrangements of blocks. This is an excellent example of how the game will introduce an obstacle in a safe environment to acclimate the player and then test them with a more dangerous version. Finally, the player is greeted with a sight they will soon become intimately familiar with: a large staircase with a flagpole at the end. The large size and sheer drop-off encourages players to take a flying leap off the top. On top of that, the previous 2 obstacles have already conditioned players to leap off the top of staircases. Doing so teaches the player that the higher that they land on the flagpole, the more points that they'll get when they finish the level. I could keep going, but I think you guys get the point. For a more thorough analysis of Super Mario Bros. Levels, I highly recommend the video How Miyamoto Designed Every Super Mario Bros. Level by Zoomzyke. But rest assured that nearly every level is designed with just as much care and attention to detail as this first one. By today's standards, all this is just Game Design 101, but it was revolutionary back in 1985. This ethos of teaching the player permeates every aspect of the game's experience, in particular the way that the game handles the use of difficulty and challenge. Super Mario Bros. Utilizes a simple but highly effective design methodology. First, establish the fundamentals. We already went over how SMB does that with its first level. Then, have the player utilize these skills in increasingly varied and challenging ways. While this is occurring, gradually introduce more mechanics that tie into the fundamentals that they already know. When a new mechanic is introduced, first let players utilize it in a relatively safe environment where the consequences for failure are low. Once this is done, begin mixing the mechanic with others to create more complex challenges. When this is done correctly, you have a system where the player is constantly developing their skill at the game, with each challenge overcome building on what they learned previously. This isn't necessarily unique to games. A good comparison would be to learning to play a musical instrument. Let's say you wanted to learn how to play the piano. How would you go about doing that? Well, first you learn the most basic fundamentals with a simple and easy-to-learn song that only uses a few keys, like chopsticks or do-re-mi. You practice it over and over until you can consistently perform it to within a certain margin for error. Then you move on to a slightly more complex and difficult song and repeat. You keep playing and mastering new songs, along the way introducing new keys or combinations of keys. And given enough time and practice, it becomes possible to play even the most complicated songs. In Super Mario Bros., each level is like one of those songs. The margin for error is the degree to which each level allows the player to make mistakes, such as getting hit by enemies, and yet still reach the end. Using this method, it's possible to learn just about anything. This is simply the most natural way for people to acquire complex skills. In the game, all of this leads to a final crescendo at the end, where all of the player's skills are put to the test. This then contributes to how Super Mario Bros. Utilizes structure and pacing to create a more dynamic experience. Since the release of the original Space Invaders, it was understood that the modulation of difficulty and the building and release of tension could create a more engaging gameplay experience. This can be represented with this graph here. Before we go any further, I should probably state that this isn't an exact mathematical representation of Space Invaders' difficulty curve. It's more of a rough approximation that I created to use as a visual aid. So take what you see here with a grain of salt. If we take a look at this, we can see that throughout the course of each round, the difficulty and tension gradually ramps up. It eventually peaks before dropping at the beginning of each new round. Each round starts off more difficult than the one before it, and the rate at which the difficulty ramps up increases over time. The end result of this is an upward curve, a difficulty curve, if you will. Now, you might be wondering, why bother decreasing the challenge and tension at the beginning of each level? Why not simply have a smooth curve that remains consistent throughout the game? This is because the player would become exhausted by the difficulty and would eventually grow numb to the tension. Much like how a rubber band that's constantly held taut will eventually snap. By easing up on the player, they remain engaged, refreshed, and it allows for a more carefully modulated emotional experience. Next, let's take a look at the graph for Super Mario Bros. Once again, this is more of a rough approximation. If we look at this graph, we can see that Super Mario Bros. Further iterates on what was established with Space Invaders. For one thing, it's a lot more granular, with a lot more smaller peaks and valleys on the way to the top. Each level operates much like a single round from Space Invaders. We can also see that the difficulty and tension ramps up much faster for the last level of each world. This creates an intense sense of rising action leading to a crescendo. Thus, we can see that the castle stages that bookend each world function as a sort of mini-climax. What Super Mario Bros. Is essentially doing is adding an extra layer to the difficulty curve. Each level has its own curve, which then builds the curve of that world, which then in turn builds the curve for the game as a whole. All of which ultimately culminates with the final battle with Bowser in level 8-4. On top of all of that, Super Mario Bros. Also balances its difficulty in such a way that it allows the player to achieve a flow state. As you can see from this graph, when modulating difficulty, it's important that it doesn't get too difficult or else the player will get frustrated, but at the same time it also can't get too easy or else the player will be bored. But if you manage to get it just right in the middle, which this game does, it allows the player to enter a flow state. All of this also serves to give structure to the game's narrative. Now, before we go any further, I should define exactly what I mean by narrative. A game's story is what is communicated through dialogue or directly shown to the player. In the case of Super Mario Bros., this would be that Bowser has invaded the Mushroom Kingdom and kidnapped Princess Peach. Mario has to rescue her. Narrative, on the other hand, refers to what is communicated to the player through the act of playing the game. I'm differentiating between story and narrative because Super Mario Bros. Story is very simple and largely superfluous. The narrative, on the other hand, is quite a bit more complicated. Anyone who has taken a middle school English class can probably recognize this chart, which shows the build and release of tension in a basic story. It starts with the beginning or exposition. Tension then builds during the rising action before peaking at the climax, then releasing during the falling action, which leads to the resolution. You will notice that this is strikingly similar to how the difficulty curves that we recently discussed with their build and release of tension work. The upward curve is the rising action leading to a climax, while the decreasing difficulty that players experience at the start of each new stage is the falling action. You could think of each level as being like a single episode of a TV series, with each one telling its own tale of adventure. Each world is like a season of that show, which has its own climax that it's building towards, usually in the season finale, which eventually builds towards the series finale in the last season. But one might ask, what exactly is the narrative being conveyed? Super Mario Bros. Is a classic tale of a hero overcoming adversity. The antagonist that he faces is physically strong, intimidating, and brutish, if perhaps a bit oafish. Mario, on the other hand, is much weaker, but he is quick, nimble, courageous, and no matter how many times he's beaten down, he will not give up. Through overcoming many trials and tribulations, he acquires the strength and skills necessary to complete his quest. The game is able to convey these ideas to the player by creating a connection between them and Mario through gameplay. Despite having almost no overt characterization, after playing for a while, it's almost impossible for the player not to empathize with Mario. This is because his frustrations are your frustrations. His triumphs are your triumphs, and his character arc, where he learns the skills to complete his quest, are the result of the player learning the skills to complete the game. This is, of course, not to say that everything which occurs within the game is strictly literal. Mario doesn't actually die and somehow come back to life 20 times on his journey. Rather, the act of dying and trying again is intended to communicate the idea of a challenging obstacle that requires tenacity to overcome. And if Super Mario Bros. Has a core moral or philosophy, it would be the importance of tenacity. Or, as Winston Churchill famously said, success is not final, failure is not fatal, it is the courage to continue that counts. Only by failing over and over again can you eventually learn what you need to succeed. Another aspect that further enhances this game's design is its use of hidden secrets. By 1985, hiding extras and Easter eggs in a game was nothing new. But as with other aspects of Super Mario Bros. Design, it's the implementation and nuance that really made this aspect stand out. This game constantly finds ways to surprise and delight players. As discussed previously, the game encourages players to thoroughly scour each level. Their reward for doing so are hidden areas, shortcuts, power-ups, and warp zones. Some of these are telegraphed, such as the warp zone at the end of 1-2. Others are far more obscure. In fact, I've played this game for decades, and I still don't think I've found everything. All of which lends the game an air of playfulness and mystery. It also allows players to essentially adjust the game's difficulty on the fly. Gaining extra 1-ups allows players to retry levels, and some difficult areas can be skipped over altogether. Warp zones have an additional purpose in that they are used on repeat playthroughs to allow more experienced players to skip ahead. Super Mario Bros. Lacked the ability to save, and unless you utilized a cheat code, there were no continues, so losing all your lives or turning the game off meant having to start over from the beginning. Using warp zones to skip to later worlds allowed players to quickly return to where they left off. And if a player knows what they're doing, they only need to complete 8 of the game's 32 levels to reach the end. Naturally, with players searching every nook and cranny for secrets, it was likely inevitable that they would eventually come across some that were unintended by the game's designers. Things like the minus world glitch, jumping over the flagpole, and the infinite 1-up trick would become the stuff of gaming legends. That being said, the way that this game utilizes secrets would eventually be greatly expanded upon in The Legend of Zelda. In terms of presentation, Super Mario Bros. Is no slouch either. Graphically, the game is bright and vibrant, taking full advantage of the NES color palette to bring the fantastical Mushroom Kingdom to life. It certainly served as a showcase for the power of the system to new adopters. Many of Super Mario Bros. Sprites are now iconic. Fun fact, due to memory limitations, several sprites had to be reused. For example, bushes and clouds both utilize the same sprite. The game's sound design is on point as well, from the pleasing sound of coin collecting to the springy sound of Mario's jumping. Super Mario Bros. Soundscape is pleasing to the ear while also subtly conditioning players to perform certain actions and avoid others. Notice how good actions such as collecting coins and grabbing power-ups produce a pleasing higher note, while bad actions such as getting hit are downshifted. One aspect of the game's presentation that deserves special attention is its soundtrack. In 1985, full game soundtracks were fairly uncommon. Often games simply didn't have music, and those that did only had maybe 1 or 2 themes plus a couple of short jingles. Super Mario Bros., on the other hand, had 6 main themes, and 5 of them featured sped-up variations for when time is running out, with plenty of additional jingles as well. This is admittedly pretty minuscule by today's standards, but it was pretty extensive for the time, and it, along with other titles from that period, helped standardize the use of more extensive full-game soundtracks. Super Mario Bros. Music is brilliantly composed and highly addictive, making excellent use of the NES's sound capabilities. Each theme perfectly sets the mood for the levels where they're featured. The ground theme is adventurous and athletic, the underwater theme is cool and graceful, the castle theme is dark and intimidating. Koji Kondo deserves a ton of credit for his amazing work. I've just spent who knows how long praising this game, so it's probably only fair that I point out some of its flaws. Despite being such a groundbreaking and influential title, that doesn't mean that this game got everything right on its first try. Plus, due to being such an influential game, it means that many titles, including many of this game's sequels, would ultimately build on and improve what this game established. One of the first issues that comes to mind is the fact that this game only has a single boss that you have to fight over and over again throughout all 8 worlds of the game. While they do try to vary it up and make it more difficult in later worlds, it doesn't save these fights from being repetitive and far too easy. It's really a shame, too, as it often causes the finale of each world, and for the game as a whole, to feel somewhat anticlimactic. For that matter, likely due to size limitations, several levels are blatantly reused with only small differences between them. For example, 1-3 and 5-3 are both exactly the same, just with the latter level adding in bullet bill enemies. In total, 5 of the game's levels are recycled, as are a number of sub-areas. This game also has kind of an odd focus on scoring, even though score doesn't really do anything. Also, for as much praise as I give the game's level design, parts of it still feel kind of rough. It's clear that they still hadn't fully perfected this style of game design, which, in my opinion, wouldn't fully mature until the release of Super Mario Bros. 3 in 1988. More than anything, though, it's clear to see that after decades of later titles building on the foundation that Super Mario Bros. Laid, this original game simply comes across as somewhat basic and simplistic. That isn't really this game's fault. There was no way that they could have known what would come after, but it's still kind of an issue for those playing it today. In spite of these flaws, this is still a fantastic game even today. The game's foundation is absolutely rock solid, and it's still a ton of fun. Playing it for only a few minutes is enough to fill even the most hardened cynic with a sense of childlike joy and wonder. It's just one of those works of art that can appeal to anyone of any age or background. Upon its release, Super Mario Bros. Was an immediate critical and commercial success, more or less acting as the killer app for the NES. Here in the US, the game is largely responsible for reviving the then-dormant console market after the disastrous video game crash of 1983. Between all of its versions, Super Mario Bros. Would end up selling more than 58 million copies, making it the 10th best-selling game of all time as of this recording. Though to be fair, a good chunk of that is likely due to the game being bundled with NES consoles. While not his first video game appearance, Super Mario Bros. Made Mario a pop culture sensation practically overnight, and it wasn't long before he started to escape the bounds of the medium, resulting in breakfast cereals, cartoons, comics, toys, and much more. In fact, a poll in 1989 found that more American children recognized Mario than Mickey Mouse. To this day, Mario remains by far the most well-known and beloved video game character, and this game helped launch what would eventually become one of the biggest multimedia franchises in the world. In terms of video games themselves, Super Mario Bros. Produced shockwaves within the medium that can still be felt to this day. It fundamentally changed the way that games were created, packaged, and sold. Super Mario Bros. Took the craft of game design, which had before existed as little more than a series of vague axioms, and turned it into an art form. It influenced countless games to come after, with some obvious examples being Alex Kidd in Miracle World, Bonk's Adventure, Sonic the Hedgehog, Wonder Boy, The Great Gianna Sisters, Kid Chameleon, and much more. Elements such as level structure, pacing, controls, and design have become ubiquitous within the medium, even within completely different genres. Nowadays, you would be hard-pressed to find a game that hasn't in some way been influenced by Super Mario Bros., either directly or indirectly. It also caused the side-scrolling platformer to become the dominant genre within gaming, and would remain so throughout the late 80s and into the early to mid-90s. It really wasn't until the widespread adoption of 3D during the fifth console generation that the genre would finally be dethroned. It also popularized the use of cartoony platforming mascots, particularly to sell consoles. The most obvious example of this, of course, is Sonic the Hedgehog on the Sega Genesis, which was created specifically to compete with Mario. The use of such characters would remain commonplace even well into the 2000s. On top of that, it, along with several other games from its era, helped push the medium away from simple high-score games. Super Mario Bros. Truly marked the dawn of a new era in gaming. Of course, Super Mario Bros. Would go on to have many sequels, ultimately marking the start of the Super Mario sub-series within the greater Mario franchise. Nearly all entries in this series would be among the finest of their respective eras, a tradition of excellence and innovation that continues to this day. On top of that, the game also helped to expand the greater Mario universe, introducing characters such as Toad, Princess Peach, Bowser, as well as many iconic series elements and enemies. Super Mario Bros. Really is one of the most significant games ever released. It ranks right up there with the likes of Pong, Space Invaders, Pac-Man, and Doom. Now, of course, with such a massively popular title, it's only natural that Super Mario Bros. Has been re-released many, many times across various platforms. There are far too many versions of this game for me to cover in just this one video, so I'm only going to go over the ones that I happen to own or are familiar with. First, we have the original for the NES and the Famicom. These two versions are pretty much exactly the same. Some of these combination cartridges were released with different console bundles. The one that I happen to have includes Super Mario Bros. Duck Hunt and World Class Track Meet. The game was also included as a part of Super Mario All-Stars on the Super Nintendo. This is a later reissue that also added in Super Mario World. They pretty much completely remastered the All-Stars version to include better 16-bit visuals. They also slightly altered the physics and collision in this version. It's not bad, but if you've played a lot of the NES version, it kind of messes with your muscle memory. The game would be brought over to the Game Boy Color as Super Mario Bros. Deluxe. This version includes a bunch of new features and extra modes. There's a challenge mode where you have to scour each level for collectibles while trying to get a high score, a mode where you race against Boo in all new levels, a new competitive multiplayer mode that has Mario and Luigi racing against each other, and even a slightly truncated version of Super Mario Bros. The Lost Levels. Unfortunately, due to the Game Boy Color having a much smaller resolution than the NES, this version suffers from severe screen crunch. It's a shame too, because if it weren't for that, this would easily be the best version. The game was also included as an unlockable in the GameCube version of Animal Crossing. Though I believe that there was no way to really access it legitimately, you pretty much had to use a cheat device to unlock it. NES Remix Pack on the Wii U features a bunch of short challenges based on Super Mario Bros. Plus, there's also an entirely new version of the game called Super Luigi Brothers. This was a part of the whole Year of Luigi that they were doing at the time. What they did was have you play as Luigi, and they flipped the entire game so that instead of going from left to right, you're instead going from right to left. It's not that different in the grand scheme of things, but kind of a fun little twist on the classic. There's the Super Mario Bros. Game & Watch unit, which contains the original game as well as the lost levels. It also contains a slightly modified version of the Game & Watch title, Ball. And as you can see, it displays the time using Super Mario Bros. Graphics. I think that this thing is really cute, and I actually personally use it as a desk clock. There was also Super Mario 35, which was released for the game's 35th anniversary, and it was pretty much a battle royale version of Super Mario Bros. It could get a touch repetitive, to be sure, but it was a lot of fun, and I remember I actually got pretty good at it after a while. Unfortunately, it's since been rendered unplayable and is now considered lost media. Probably the easiest and most convenient way to play Super Mario Bros. Today is through the Nintendo Switch Online service. I actually used that version to get several of the screenshots that I've used in this very video. But that will be all for today. Please remember to like, comment, share, and subscribe. This video is sponsored by M&M Games, and I will see you guys next time.